The really interesting thing was when my mom came to visit me for the first time, obviously very Afro presenting. She came to visit me when I was in college, and I would never forget. We took the bus, we got on the bus, and the bus driver was Black, and my mom was flabbergasted. And she was like, "Oh my God, Majd, he's Black just like me." And he laughed so hard. He was like, "Yes, sis, I'm Black too." And she felt so good in that moment. She felt seen. She felt, wow, like this is amazing.
Welcome to Until All of Us Are Free, a year-long multimedia education project dedicated to Black liberation as collective liberation. I am your host and creator of this project, Ijeoma Oluo. In a lot of discussion around Black and Palestinian solidarity, there is also discussion of anti-Blackness within the Palestinian community. And one frustration that I've often had with these discussions is the fact that usually those most impacted by anti-Blackness in the Palestinian community are left out of the discussion, that being Afro-Palestinians. And so I asked my good friend Majd to sit down and have a conversation with me about anti-Blackness in the Palestinian community and anti-Blackness in Palestinian liberation and Black liberation. And I am so excited to share this conversation with you. This is much more of a casual style. It's not as edited as our other episodes will be, but I really wanted to just sit down and talk with my friend about this important topic. Majd Baniodé is an Afro-Palestinian woman born and raised in Palestine. Majd moved to the U.S. in 2005 in pursuit of higher education and has since built a life and family here in Seattle. Majd has spent her personal and professional life building local and global initiatives committed to making a more just and equitable world. Majd is a proud mom of 2 kiddos who light up her world and have made the last year of genocide worth living through. I found, especially when we're having conversations around anti-Blackness, especially with the Palestinian Arab communities, we do apply a very American lens to it. But when we have discussions around anti-Blackness with the Palestinian Arab community, a lot of it is about the connections or lack of connections that many of the Palestinian Arab community have here in the United States with Black people. Do you see a difference in how Palestinian Americans relate to Black Americans versus how lighter skinned Palestinians related to Afro-Palestinians in Palestine?
The identity of Afro-Palestinians is not talked about, but also the experience that we have in the world is not talked about either. In Palestine, it's pretty Black and white. So you're lesser if you're darker, you're better if you're whiter. Anti-Blackness within the Arab and Palestinian community exists, absolutely. Yeah, I grew up in Palestine with a Black mother and a very white-presenting Palestinian father. The difference was very clear. As a young child, we would get called out a lot when we were younger. She's the slave, quote unquote, or she is the Black one, the dark one. Oh, we don't want this so-and-so to marry someone like her. All of that does exist. It's not systematic. There's no infrastructure for government, or there's no infrastructure for policy. And it's not as big and racist and integrated into the country because we have always been peoples that have only suffered. Whereas the United States, it's discriminating against Black people from the very beginning. There's an inherent systematic thing going on here. But it's nuanced because once you talk about anti-Blackness within the Palestinian community, you cannot not talk about the oppression that we face from the Israeli occupation and the experience as a Palestinian in general. The anti-Blackness, it's still there, but we are more united than we are against one another. The common denominator that we all had as Palestinians is our experience under the Israeli occupation and apartheid. Maybe I'm wrong. I think in the struggle, we all become one. Whether there's violence or not violence, we're all united against one enemy. And the enemy is occupation. The enemy is apartheid. The enemy is denying us our livelihood and our safety.
It reminds me of, as a queer Black American, white people would often be like, you know that Black people are more homophobic and that they hate you. And I was like, cops will come after me because I'm Black. And I feel like we forget that right now people are being bombed regardless of their demographic in Palestine. They're being murdered. They are all under risk from the state, but also communities under severe oppression. There's this hierarchy of need, right? And getting to where you're like, can we talk about what's happening in our community? Can we build a more, inclusive community? That always comes second to survival when you literally have bombs dropping on your head.
When it comes to violence and oppression, we're all united. We're all working towards the same goal. I grew up in the first and second Intifada. It's so interesting to remember those moments and that unity that we had with one another. Whereas when I think about, for example, mid-90s, all the way into the early 2000s, it wasn't nearly as violent because we hadn't had the second Intifada. And our experience was very much different. I very vividly remember one day I was walking down the street with a couple of my friends from school, and a woman stopped us in the street and she said, "Hey, girls, I'm looking for families that have young girls between the age of 18 to 25. I want to marry off my son. Do you know any girls around here?" And we're like, "No, we really don't." Or at the time we were, 12, 13. And she said, "Yeah, we really want to look at a girl that looks like," and she looked at my friend who was very Caucasian looking, "like her," and then pointed at me, "Not like this one, not like the Black one." And I had so much pride in my Blackness, but we also didn't have the phrase Afro-Palestinian either. It was only when I came to the US and I saw more people that looked like me, then I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is a thing.
What's it been like to come to the US and come into this Afro-Palestinian identity and deal with these discussions around race here in the US?
It's been the most liberating aspect of my identity to be able to say I am Afro-Palestinian, because I'm not just Palestinian. My mother is Black and her roots are African. And that's very different than being dark-skinned, brown Palestinian. And I've really come to not just be proud of that identity, but just embrace it in every way. And I'm still learning a lot about it. But I think it's also been difficult because I, for the first time, was able to see the treatment and the consequences of being Black in this country. Not to the extent of darker skinned Black folks, obviously, but also the discrimination that is so, it could be small, it could be body language or a policy, your work or something. But I will say it's been so liberating because things made sense. Whereas before I kept thinking, well, I feel very Palestinian, but I also don't look Palestinian. Why is that? I'm not light-skinned. I'm not that I ever wanted to be, but it always felt different. And coming here, and I would never forget, I landed in DC. My first week here was August 2005. And it was the first time I've seen Black people near me. And I was like, whoa, this makes sense. It felt so familial and it felt like where I was supposed to be.
We're talking about the lack of structural, systemic anti-Blackness. And part of it being, one, it's hard to have a full functioning system when you're under full oppression. But also, one thing I think a lot of people leave out in these conversations around anti-Blackness with the Palestinian community is the actual structural anti-Blackness of Israel. And
yes.
Like that is actually built into the systems. And when you look at the incarceration and the deliberate exclusion of African peoples in Israel, Black Israelis, and how often they're imprisoned, how often they're sent to the most dangerous front lines in this occupation, how often they're beaten by police, how often they're face employment and education discrimination.
It's very much real. And they oftentimes put them, on the front line, on the borders, and on the, not first responders, but, border agents. And, but it's really, you can even see the discrimination within that. And it's really tough as an Afro-Palestinian to have any compassion when you're at the border with someone who oftentimes it's Black men they're put in the front. He'll decide whether you enter or not enter, or whether you get interrogated or not interrogated. It's hard to have a compassion for a fellow Black person who also is an Israeli soldier. Because in your head, I'm like, God, I know that we're the same, but we're not. But I can see the discrimination too. But I block my emotion at that moment because he obviously has a gun. He has my fate in his hands. I cannot entertain any sort of emotions or any sort of, connection with this person. Our past and our present and our experience of being Palestinian is so atrocious that you've got to build the walls. I very vividly remember being young and getting our house bombed when we were in it. And there were young Israeli soldiers, like they're 18, they're holding all these guns and all these bombs, and they blew up our front door and entered. And we were so scared and we were so young, and my mom was holding us. They took my dad away, and you could tell that they're scared too. In my head, I'm like, I wonder if they're afraid because they look afraid. And I'm like, why the heck am I having why am I thinking of them? Like, it's so hard as a human to not think of all these things too, even in moments of fear, even in moments when you think that your life is in danger. And I'm like, no, I can't think that way. Quite literally, they have my life in their hands. I have to just shut it down. It hardens you. The occupation and apartheid system hardens you. It's really a very painful experience. I think particularly Afro-Israelis, they have experienced persecution. They have experienced oppression in their home countries, that when they move to Israel and seek citizenship and all of that, yes, they have a lot to prove, but also they have been fed this narrative that because they are Jewish, that we are the enemy, as in the Palestinians, and that we would do the same thing to them if they didn't act as atrocious as they do act.
And I feel like we have to be aware of how systems do this to us. And it doesn't mean that people aren't responsible, right? It doesn't mean that you don't look at a soldier holding a gun and they may be Afro-Israeli and they may well be facing violent discrimination in Israel. You can look at that and you can hold the state of Israel responsible for that, but you can also look at this person who is holding this gun and is making a choice. And so they're responsible as well. And I think when we talk about anti-Blackness, we have to talk about that as well. And we forget that. We forget the nuances that every non-Black person of color, and honestly, even a lot of Black people who exhibit anti-Blackness, I say this as a Nigerian American, as someone who has seen this sort of anti-Blackness in many other Africans. We're all making choices that we're responsible for, but we're not only responsible parties. And we have to start talking about, if we want collective liberation, how these systems are conditioning us and often in many ways making us feel like we have no choice but to play a part.
I think in the United States, I can't speak for how things were in the past between Palestinian Americans and African Americans, but what I will say is I've noticed a large shift in the way the Palestinian Americans relate to African Americans, to Black people in this country, because they see things differently now. In a lot of ways, they've had light-skinned privilege. They may have, in this country, been perceived as white. They may have been perceived as brown. But now, and especially in the last year, they feel discrimination in the workplace. They feel a lot of things that Black folks have felt for so many years, that they have more understanding of the experience. I will say, Palestinians, whether Afro-Palestinians or like Palestinians, have known about Black people struggling in the United States for far longer and understood the experience, particularly around the militarization and that aspect of being oppressed, that Jim Crow, right? Like, that's what's happening in Palestine now. They have been empathetic and been understanding of that. But I cannot say the same about Palestinian Americans, because when I first moved here, I did notice that there wasn't a connection. And that was my experience only, right? But I did notice that I either hung out with Black people or I hung out with some Palestinian people, but it was never in community together. Whereas now we are in community together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We are doing things, like we are more united than ever.
Yeah.
And I think it's because the genocide has woken up so many Palestinians whose identity has been either suppressed because you're not allowed to talk about this, or you try to assimilate, but there's no escaping it now. And the violence and atrocities are so huge. They're so unspeakable that it impacts you as an individual, as a Palestinian. So how can you go out in the world, into this white world, and be okay? and not say, I want to talk about this in my workplace. I want to talk about this in my community. I mean, we've lost friendships. We've lost community members because we don't see eye to eye when it comes to the genocide.
Absolutely. And when you talk about that, it makes me think about Black identity is a politicized identity, right? Black identity is created by Black people, and it is a political statement, and it's a worldwide political statement that Black Americans have done a lot of work towards forming. It is a choosing to be politically Black.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting to watch because as a Black American who grew up with this Black identity, but also has a Palestinian family and Palestinian friends and grown up with Palestinian Americans, and I think in Palestine and in Gaza, it's an inherently political identity to be Palestinian because you have a state saying you don't exist. And so that's very political. But I think a lot of people, when they came here, the definition of safety was, what if I let this go? And so I think this year it's been interesting to see in spaces that are very identity centered, that I've spent a lot of time in, to see more Palestinians. You don't get to casually be Palestinian in this world, just like you can't casually be Black in this world.
I want to talk about that, actually.
This is part 1 of my conversation with Majd around Palestine and anti-Blackness. In part 2 of this discussion, we'll be talking about Black and Palestinian identity and solidarity, especially in light of this most recent presidential election, and where we go from there. Make sure that you are subscribed at untilwearefree.com so you don't miss that episode. There's a lot of great stuff in there. And also while you're there, you can become a supporter. This is a completely self-funded project, so your support at untilwearefree.com really helps me make the best content I can and to keep this all accessible to as many people as possible. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for supporting. And we'll catch you in part 2 of this episode.